The next few slides cover some basic characteristics of populations and species communities as well. This slide here is talking about species dominance. Some species that are so large or so abundant in a particular community can be called a dominant species. And those species just take up the most space, most energy, resources, biomass, just by their sheer size or volume, and those would be considered dominant species. Some examples of dominant species are Macrocystis. This is the giant kelp in the upper right. Also on the lower left, mangroves are very important, the mangrove plants. Other examples of dominant species, mangrove plants, critically important to coastlines in semi-tropical and tropical regions, and kelp forests that line some of the coastlines of temperate areas of the world. Another important characteristic of communities would be the keystone species. These are species that have a disproportionately large effect on the environment that they live in relative to their abundance, meaning they're not really abundant, they're not like dominant species, but they have a big effect on many other species in that community. They're very important. A keystone is an architectural term that comes from that stone that's right at the top of a stone arch, an archway in a building, and that stone is flared so it holds all the other stones up. Without that key stone, the whole arch would collapse, and perhaps that wall of the building, and that one stone holds all the pressure from both sides. So in an ecological sense, a keystone species is one that is related to so many others and keeps so many other parts of the community of species in balance that it's critical and very important. Here are some examples of keystone species. The branching tree coral is found in temperate waters, kind of around Florida, the South Atlantic states there on the coast. And its relationship with the symbiotic microalgae is important, and also it forms somewhat like small forests of this coral that provides habitat for many other organisms. It's been found when this is removed, a lot of other species leave the area or do not survive. African elephants are keystone species too, because they are sometimes considered ecosystem engineers, dramatically shaping their habitats, affecting vegetation, riverbeds, creating water holes that serve many other organisms. They are also known to be very critical to holding a lot of species together in the communities there. Sea otters, very similarly, are keystone species. They keep the sea urchins at bay and the sea urchin population levels low by eating those. And if they didn't, the sea urchins will feed on the kelp itself and decimate the kelp. So as sea otters were hunted in the past, we saw a lot of loss of kelp forests. Lastly, ochre stars, they keep populations of mussels and barnacles in check, and that ensures the healthy populations of the seaweeds and the communities that feed on them, sea urchins, sea snails, limpets, and bivalves. This ochre star and other sea stars like this were the first animals to be identified as keystone species. This is a little bit deeper dive into looking at sea otters and the role they play as a keystone species. If you look at a marine habitat with sea otters and in the kelp forest, the sea otters are eating the sea urchins and sea stars, crabs, sometimes larger fish. Those things feed on other organisms like algae, abalone, smaller herbivorous creatures which eat the seaweed itself. So you can see if you take out that sea otter from the system, as you see on the right bottom, the urchins start to take over and decimate the kelp, which then disallows or prevents all those other organisms from having a place to live, reproduce, and feed on that algae. All the grayed out species in that ones are the ones that fall away, and those populations go away, and you get a much more simplified system without the sea otters. Thinking about sea stars as Keystone species, very similar to the sea otter in the kelp forest. Looking here, if you have the natural state on the left and sea stars are removed, what happens is the very competitive mussels take over. They outcompete the other species and it becomes almost a monoculture of mussels. So this keystone species, the sea stars, or Pisaster is the genus name, they are keeping those levels of mussels low enough so that other species can coexist and there can be a diverse habitat.